The grand boardroom of the Kensington estate was practically a war zone, with billionaires and politicians shouting over trade agreements. But when a foolish advisor slammed his fist down, demanding the Alpha's attention, Alexander's eyes flashed crimson. He growled, "Wake the Omega sleeping on my chest, and you die." The room froze. The Kensington estate, colloquially known among the global elite as the Palace, was a sprawling neo-Gothic fortress nestled in the remote highlands of Scotland. It was the nerve centre of Alexander Kensington's empire. Alexander was an alpha of terrifying lineage, a man whose conglomerate controlled half of Europe's shipping lanes and private security sectors. In the modern Omegaverse, where primal biology was masked by tailored suits and billions of dollars, Alexander was practically a king, and he ruled like a tyrant. But on this particular Tuesday, the tyrant's chest was occupied. Toby Cavendish, a delicate Omega with a spirit that usually burned brighter than a supernova, was entirely hidden beneath the heavy lapels of Alexander's oversized cashmere overcoat. Toby was curled into a tiny, exhausted ball on Alexander's lap, his face pressed flush against the Alpha's sternum. His soft, rhythmic breathing was the only thing keeping the Alpha's predatory instincts at bay. The air in the grand boardroom was thick with suffocating tension. 20 of the most powerful Alphas and Betas in the Western Hemisphere sat around a massive mahogany table, their pheromones spiking with frustration and agitation. They were discussing a hostile takeover of a rival tech firm, a deal worth billions, and their supreme leader was distracted. Alexander sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, one massive hand gently cupping the back of Toby's head to shield the Omega's sensitive ears from the noise, the other resting flat on the table. For weeks, the palace had been under siege from within. There had been leaks to the press, sabotage in their Mediterranean ports, and most terrifyingly, an unexplained illness that had struck Toby. Toby, who was fiercely independent and normally despised public displays of affection, had collapsed earlier that morning. His sweet scent of vanilla and spun sugar had soured into the sharp, distressing aroma of burnt honey. Alexander had refused to let him out of his sight, since carrying the semi-conscious Omega into the most high-stakes financial council meeting of the decade. The room's collective patience was fraying. Richard Harrington, the chief financial officer and a beta with aspirations far above his station, leaned forward. His face was flushed with indignation. Harrington had been pushing for aggressive restructuring, and Alexander's talent glaring dismissal was making him look weak in front of the board. "Alexander, with all due respect," Harrington barked, his voice booming and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "We are bleeding capital in the Baltic sector. You cannot simply sit there and ignore the projections. We need a signature on the liquidation order, and we need it now." Harrington, emboldened by the silent agreement of the other board members, stood up. He slammed his open palm flat against the mahogany table. Smack! The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Beneath the cashmere coat, Toby whimpered. The Omega's slender fingers dug into Alexander's silk tie, his breathing hitching in a panic. The sudden sharp noise had jolted him from his fragile, desperately needed slumber. Alexander didn't shout. He didn't stand. He didn't even blink. The Alpha simply tilted his head, his piercing, icy blue eyes locking onto Harrington. A wave of dominant Alpha pheromones, thick, suffocating and smelling of ozone and crushing winter frost, rolled over the table. Several of the lesser Alphas in the room, physically gagged, their hands flying to their throats as their primal instincts screamed at them to submit. Alexander leaned forward just an inch, his voice dropping to a low, guttural vibration that resonated in the chest of every man in the room. "Wake the Omega sleeping on my chest," Alexander growled, the raw, lethal intent in his voice stripping away any veneer of civilized humanity, "and you die." The entire palace froze. It wasn't a corporate threat. It wasn't a metaphor. The absolute, unhinged sincerity in Alexander's tone made it a blood promise. Harrington's face drained of color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. His knees visibly buckled, and he slowly, carefully lowered himself back into his leather chair, trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence was so absolute that the soft, frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a hammer against an anvil. Alexander gently stroked the back of Toby's neck, releasing a soothing burst of cedar and rain scent, a localized, calming pheromone meant only for his mate. He murmured something soft and indistinguishable against the crown of Toby's head, rocking slightly until the Omega's breathing leveled out again, the distressed whimpering fading back into a soft, exhausted sigh. Only when Toby was fully submerged in sleep once more did Alexander look back up at his board of directors. "The Baltic sector will hold until I say otherwise," Alexander whispered, his voice still laced with lethal frost. "This meeting is adjourned. If a single one of you makes a sound on your way out, my security team will escort you off the cliffs." It was a scramble of silent terror. Billionaires, politicians, and hardened executives gathered their leather briefcases with shaking hands. Chairs were pushed back with excruciating slowness to avoid even the scrape of wood against the Persian rugs. Within 90 seconds, the grand boardroom was entirely empty, save for the Alpha King and his sleeping mate. Dominic Russo, Alexander's head of security and most trusted confidant, stepped out from the shadows near the grand double doors. Dominic was a massive alpha, heavily scarred from his days in elite military units, but his demeanor around Toby was always that of a protective older brother. "They're gone, boss," Dominic murmured, keeping his voice strictly at a whisper. "But Harrington is furious. He's already texting the European shareholders." "Let him," Alexander replied, finally shifting his weight. He carefully stood up, ensuring Toby remained securely wrapped in his arms. The Omega's legs dangled limply, his face buried deep in the crook of Alexander's neck. "Harrington is a symptom, Dominic, not the disease. Tell Dr. Preston to meet us in the West Wing medical suite. Immediately." The West Wing of the Kensington Palace was strictly off-limits to everyone except Alexander and Toby. It was a fortress within a fortress. As Alexander strode down the dimly lit, velvet-lined corridors, the heavy weight of the situation began to crush him. Toby felt too light. The Omega had always been slender, possessing a dancer's build, but the recent weeks had stripped him of his vitality. Toby wasn't just an Omega to Alexander. He was the anchor to his humanity. They had met 2 years prior under horrific circumstances. Toby's father, a degenerate gambler, had tried to sell Toby to a rival syndicate to pay off debts. Alexander had intercepted the trade, initially intending to use Toby as leverage. Instead, Toby had fought back, sinking his teeth into Alexander's hand on their first meeting and refusing to bow to the Alpha's oppressive aura. That fire, that relentless defiance, had captivated Alexander. He had destroyed the rival syndicate, wiped the father's debt, and spent a year courting the prickly Omega until Toby finally realized the terrifying Alpha would burn the world down to keep him warm. Now someone was trying to take Toby away. Alexander pushed open the reinforced doors to the medical suite. Dr. Henry Preston, a brilliant beta physician who had served the Kensington family for 3 decades, was already washing his hands at the stainless steel sink. "Put him on the observation bed, Alex," Dr. Preston said quietly, skipping the formalities. He dried his hands and grabbed a specialized diagnostic scanner. Alexander gently laid Toby down on the plush mattress, though he refused to let go of the Omega's hand. He brushed a damp curl of chestnut hair from Toby's pale forehead. Up close, the damage was undeniable. There were dark, bruised circles under Toby's eyes, and his usually rosy lips were a full, chapped lavender. "His scent is breaking down," Alexander stated, his voice tight with suppressed panic. "It went sour this morning. He couldn't stand. He just kept saying he was cold." Dr. Preston worked quickly, drawing a small vial of blood from Toby's arm before attaching biometric sensors to his chest and temples. "I've been analyzing the samples we took yesterday," the doctor murmured, his brow furrowing as he looked at the scrolling data on his monitor. "Alexander, it's not an autoimmune failure. It's not stress from the mating bond either." Alexander stiffened. "Explain." Dr. Preston turned to look the alpha directly in the eye, his expression grim. "He's being poisoned, systematically, in incredibly small, precise doses." The air in the room plummeted in temperature. Dominic, who was standing guard by the door, let out a low, menacing growl. "Poisoned?" Alexander's voice was barely a breath, but it carried the weight of an executioner's axe. "It's a synthetic compound," Dr. Preston explained, bringing up a complex chemical breakdown on the screen. "A heavily modified derivative of aconitine B, tailored specifically to target an Omega's endocrine system. It suppresses their natural pheromone production, induces profound lethargy, and slowly starves the heart muscle of oxygen. It mimics a rare genetic heart failure. If he had collapsed in a public hospital, any standard toxicology screen would have missed it completely." "Who has access to him?" Alexander demanded, his grip on Toby's hand tightening just enough to ground himself. "Who prepares his meals?" "Only the inner circle," Dominic answered immediately, stepping into the room. "Head Chef Louis, the 2 senior housekeepers, and myself. All of them have been vetted 100 times over. They're fiercely loyal to Toby. Louis practically views him as a son. Loyalty can be bought or coerced," Alexander said, his eyes darkening to a terrifying pitch black. "No one eats or drinks anything in this house until I find the rat. Dominic, lock down the estate. Jam all outgoing signals. No one leaves. No one makes a call." Before Dominic could move, a soft, dry cough echoed in the quiet room. Alexander instantly dropped to his knees beside the bed, his terrifying demeanor evaporating as he looked at his mate. Toby's eyelashes were fluttering, his brow furrowing in pain as consciousness slowly returned. "Alexander," Toby whispered, his voice raspy and weak. "I'm here, my love. I'm right here," Alexander murmured, pressing a desperate kiss to Toby's knuckles. "Don't try to sit up. You're safe." Toby swallowed hard, his glazed hazel eyes slowly coming into focus. He looked past Alexander to Dr. Preston, then to Dominic. Despite the exhaustion radiating from his small frame, the familiar, defiant spark flickered in his eyes. "I heard you," Toby managed to croak out, his throat dry. "In the boardroom, you threatened to kill Harrington." "He woke you," Alexander said simply, as if that justified murder in front of 20 witnesses. To him, it did. A faint, breathless chuckle escaped Toby's lips, though it quickly turned into a wince. "You're an idiot, Alpha," Toby whispered affectionately. He took a shaky breath, his expression suddenly turning serious, desperate. But you need to listen to me." "Toby, rest," Dr. Preston urged, stepping forward. "Your heart rate is too low." "No, shut up, Henry," Toby interrupted, his grip on Alexander's hand suddenly becoming surprisingly strong. He locked eyes with his alpha. I wasn't fully asleep in the boardroom. I was too tired to move, but I could hear them. Before the meeting officially started, before you brought me in, I was resting in the antechamber. Alexander's heart pounded. The antechamber was separated from the main boardroom by a thin adjoining door. "What did you hear, little bird?" "Harrington," Toby gasped, fighting through a wave of nausea. He was talking to someone on a burner phone. He didn't know I was on the sofa in the dark. He said, "The dosage is too slow. The Cayman accounts are ready, but the Alpha isn't distracted enough. Give the Omega a larger dose in his morning tea. We need a tragic accident by Friday, so we can push the liquidation through during the mourning period." Silence fell over the medical suite, thick and suffocating. The pieces slammed together in Alexander's mind with terrifying clarity. Harrington wasn't just a disgruntled executive. He was the architect of the poisoning. He was trying to kill Toby to break Alexander emotionally, ensuring the Alpha would be too paralyzed by grief to stop a hostile takeover and the liquidation of the company's most valuable assets. "Morning tea," Dominic muttered, his face turning pale. "Toby's chamomile. I brought it to him this morning, but I didn't pour it. Harrington's assistant, a beta named Philip, bumped into me in the kitchen. He offered to carry the tray while I took a call." Dominic looked at Alexander, horror dawning in his eyes. "I let him poison Toby." Alexander stood up slowly. The sheer magnitude of his rage was no longer hot and explosive. It had gone entirely cold. It was a calculating, abyssal wrath. "Dominic," Alexander said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "you are not at fault, but I need you to do exactly as I say." "Anything, boss. Take a detail of my personal guard. Go to Harrington's suite in the East Wing. Do not kill him, but ensure that he understands the gravity of touching what is mine." Alexander turned back to look at Toby, his eyes softening only for his mate. "Bring him to the soundproof interrogation rooms in the sub-basement, and find his assistant." As Dominic nodded and turned to leave, the biometric monitors attached to Toby suddenly let out a shrill, piercing alarm. Toby's eyes rolled back into his head, his back arching violently off the mattress as a violent seizure took hold of his frail body. "Toby!" Alexander roared, lunging forward to hold him. "The larger dose!" Dr. Preston shouted, scrambling for a crash cart. "It's hitting his nervous system. Hold him down, Alexander. If he thrashes, he'll break his own bones." As Alexander pinned his thrashing, dying mate to the bed, the Alpha's roar of pure, unfiltered agony echoed through the stone halls of the palace, a promise of the absolute massacre that was about to unfold. The medical monitors screamed a high-pitched, relentless drone that threatened to shatter the reinforced glass of the West Wing. Toby's slender frame arched so violently off the mattress it seemed as though his spine might snap. His eyes rolled back to expose only the whites. "Hold his shoulders, Alexander. Don't let his head hit the rails," Dr. Preston shouted, completely abandoning the deferential tone he usually reserved for the Alpha. He slammed a heavy syringe into a vial, his hands moving with the desperate speed of a trauma surgeon. Alexander's massive hands clamped down on Toby's shoulders, pinning the thrashing Omega to the bed. The Alpha's face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He flooded the room with thick, suffocating cedar and rain pheromones, desperately trying to trigger Toby's biological submission reflexes to calm his nervous system. But the synthetic poison was blocking the mate bond. "He's slipping, Henry! His pulse is vanishing!" Alexander roared, the primal panic cracking his stoic facade. "It's a myocardial infarction cascade. "The aconitine B is locking his sodium channels," Dr. Preston yelled back. He plunged the needle directly into the IV line, pulsing at Toby's wrist. "I'm pushing a massive dose of amiodarone and a proprietary chelating agent. It's going to burn, but it has to force the heart to reset." For 5 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Toby's body remained rigidly arched, his lips turning a terrifying shade of cyanotic blue. Alexander buried his face into Toby's neck, his broad shoulders shaking, entirely uncaring of the tears soaking into the hospital gown. Then, with a violent gasp, Toby's chest collapsed. The seizure snapped to a halt. His body went entirely limp against the mattress. The shrill flat line of the monitor stuttered, then slowly, agonizingly, fell back into a weak, rhythmic beep, beep, beep. Dr. Preston slumped against the stainless steel counter, wiping cold sweat from his brow. He's stabilized. The binder caught the excess toxin in his bloodstream. But Alexander, he's in a deep, comatose state. The strain on his heart was catastrophic. The next 48 hours will determine if he wakes up. Alexander didn't move for a long time. He kept his face buried in his mate's scent gland, breathing in the faint, sour remnants of vanilla and burnt honey. When he finally lifted his head, the terrified lover was gone. The Alpha King had returned. His icy blue eyes were completely void of emotion, resembling the dead of winter. The air pressure in the room visibly dropped, thick with a killing intent so potent that Dr. Preston had to lean against the wall to keep from suffocating. "Keep him breathing, Henry," Alexander whispered, his voice smooth and deadly. "If his heart stops, you start it again. I have a pest control issue to handle." Alexander turned on his heel and strode out of the medical suite. He descended past the opulent carpets of the main floors, taking the private elevator down into the sub-basement. This was a sector of the Kensington Palace that no board member or shareholder knew existed. It was lined with soundproof concrete, stark fluorescent lights, and heavy steel doors. Dominic was waiting outside Interrogation Room B. The massive security chief looked grim. They are both inside. Harrington is blustering, threatening legal action and calling his lawyers. The assistant, Philip, hasn't said a word. Alexander didn't bother replying. He pushed open the heavy steel door. Inside, Richard Harrington and his beta assistant, Philip, were strapped to heavy iron chairs bolted to the floor. The moment Alexander stepped into the room, Harrington's blustering ceased. The raw, predatory aura rolling off the Alpha was enough to make the older executive physically gag. "Alexander, listen to me. This is a massive misunderstanding," Harrington stammered, his eyes darting wildly. "You have no right to hold a board member." "Toby just flatlined on my table," Alexander interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. Yet it echoed like a thunderclap in the concrete room. Harrington swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. I don't know what you're talking about." "The boy is sick, Alexander. You're projecting your grief onto the board." Alexander walked slowly to the metal table, sitting between them. He pulled a sleek tablet from his coat pocket and slid it across the surface. "I don't deal in grief, Richard. I deal in data," Alexander said coldly. 10 minutes ago, my cyber division decrypted the burner phone you used in the antechamber. I know exactly where the capital from the Baltic sector was being diverted. You thought you were clever routing the money through offshore accounts at Credit Suisse. You thought masking the shell companies under the umbrella of Constelli, the private military contractor, would hide the paper trail. Harrington's face drained of the last remnants of blood. His jaw trembled. How did you—" "I own the subsidiary that audits Constelli," Alexander sneered. "You plotted to murder my mate, to force a mourning liquidation. But you are not smart enough to orchestrate a synthetic biological weapon. Aconitine B derivatives aren't bought on the dark web. They are engineered. Who supplied you, Richard? Before Harrington could formulate a lie, a sudden dark chuckle echoed in the room. Both Alexander and Harrington looked at Philip. The seemingly timid beta assistant was laughing. The subservient posture had vanished, replaced by a chilling, relaxed arrogance. "You're looking at the wrong man, Kensington," Philip said, leaning back in his iron restraints, completely unfazed by Alexander's alpha aura. "Richard here is just a greedy, useful idiot. He wanted your shipping lanes. My employer wanted something much more personal." Alexander's eyes narrowed, his gaze locking on to the beta. "And who is your employer?" "Bastian Hayes." Philip smiled, his teeth stained with blood from where Dominic had previously hit him. "He sends his regards. He never forgot what you did to his European syndicate 5 years ago. Taking your little Omega wasn't just business. It was a message. Bastian wanted you to watch the light go out of his eyes." The revelation hung in the air like a guillotine. Bastian Hayes was a phantom in the underground financial world, an alpha who ran an illicit empire mirroring Alexander's legitimate one. Harrington looked at his assistant in sheer horror. "Hayes? Philip, what are you talking about? You told me the backing was from a Swiss hedge fund." "Shut up, Richard, you pathetic pawn," Philip spat. He looked back at Alexander, his eyes gleaming with fanatic loyalty. "The poison is already in his nervous system, Kensington. There is no cure. By the time you kill me, your little Omega will be a corpse, and Bastian will have already initiated the hostile takeover of your Mediterranean ports." Alexander didn't roar. He didn't lose his temper. The true terror of the Alpha King was his absolute, freezing restraint. He calmly reached into his tailored jacket, withdrew a suppressed Heckler & Koch tactical pistol, and shot Philip through the right kneecap. The loud pfft of the suppressor was instantly drowned out by Philip's agonizing scream. Blood sprayed across the concrete floor. Harrington began sobbing hysterically, straining against his restraints. "Dominic," Alexander said calmly, ignoring the screaming man. Dominic stepped into the room. "Yes, boss. Get me Director Reynolds at Interpol on line 1. Then contact the board of directors at Credit Suisse. I am calling in all my favors," Alexander ordered, his eyes never leaving Philip's agonizing pale face. "Bastian Hayes thinks he can hide behind proxies. I want every account associated with Hayes, his associates, and his bloodline frozen within the hour. Liquidate his dummy corporations. Buy out his debt and default it. I want him entirely bankrupt before the sun sets. Consider it done." Dominic grinned ruthlessly. Alexander stepped closer to Philip, pressing the hot suppressor of the gun against the beta's cheek. "You thought Bastian was a god. In 3 hours, he will be a penniless fugitive hunted by every agency in Europe. As for you, Philip, you are going to give Dominic the exact chemical formula of the poison you used. If you refuse, I will have the medical team keep you alive in this basement while we test every neurotoxin in existence on you." Alexander stood up, straightening his cuffs. He looked at Harrington, who was currently weeping and hyperventilating. "Dominic, when you have the formula, take them to the cliffs," Alexander said casually, as if ordering a coffee. "Ensure the tide is high." Leaving the basement, Alexander felt the exhaustion of the day, threatening to pull him under. He had burned empires to the ground, but none of it mattered if the center of his universe was gone. He rushed back to the West Wing, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. When he pushed open the doors to the medical suite, the room was quiet. Dr. Preston was sitting in a chair, a soft smile on his face. He pointed toward the bed. The heavy biometric monitors had been removed. Toby was lying on a mountain of pillows, his skin still pale, but the sickly, bruised color was fading. His chest rose and fell in a steady, natural rhythm. As Alexander approached the bed, Toby's eyelashes fluttered. The hazel eyes opened, bleary but focused. He looked at the massive, terrifying Alpha, whose hands were currently shaking as he reached out. "You look like hell, Alpha," Toby rasped, a weak, lopsided smile touching his lips. A choked sob tore itself from Alexander's throat. He collapsed to his knees beside the bed, burying his face in the crook of Toby's neck, inhaling deeply. The sourness was gone. The sweet, comforting scent of vanilla and spun sugar was blooming once more, weak but undeniably alive. "I have you," Alexander whispered brokenly, his tears wetting Toby's skin. "I have you, little bird. It's over." Toby weakly lifted a hand, threading his fingers into Alexander's dark hair, his Omega instincts purring softly to soothe his distressed mate. "I know," Toby whispered, his eyes hardening with a quiet, resilient fire that reminded Alexander exactly why he fell in love with him. "They tried to break the king, but they forgot about the queen." Alexander lifted his head, gazing at his mate with a reverence bordering on worship. Bastion Hayes was ruined, the traitors were dead, and the board would never dare utter a word out of line again. The Alpha King had defended his throne, but as he kissed Toby's forehead, he knew the truth. His empire only existed to keep his Omega safe, and heaven help anyone who ever forgot it again. Did you love the intense twists and ruthless drama of Alexander and Toby's story? If you want more high-stakes Omegaverse thrillers, billionaire romances, and heart-pounding vengeance, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with your friends who love a fiercely protective Alpha and a resilient Omega. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming stories. Drop a comment below. What should we name Alexander's next rival?